Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
Are you more of a sweet or salty snack kind of person? Hey, it's Jen. Welcome back to the Bible for Busy People, and I bet you weren't expecting to hear that question. I know for me, I usually lean more towards salty. You already know I'm a fan of sour cream and onion Pringles. I don't think I've mentioned to you how much I love Trader Joe's chili lime chips either. I really, really like those. But I can't really do sweets anymore. I tell people this all the time. I used to be able to go to McDonald's and get their gigantic cup of sweet tea that they used to have for $1. I don't know what they charge for it now. And I would drink that whole cup of sweet tea so quickly. I can't do sweets like that anymore. I can't really drink very heavily sweetened drinks. And I just don't do a ton of sweets. Sometimes I do, but they don't make me feel good. Anyway, I have a point and I'm getting to it. Today, adding to our Beatitudes series, we are going a little bit more into the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, which says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Yes, the salt has a point. But why salt? I have never quite gone too in depth with this. I've heard different theories, but going into it today, oh my goodness, there's actually so much to this. So let's dig in a little bit. Now, when you think of salt or salty, you might, if you're a millennial or maybe a Gen Z person, you might think of the slang like, why are you being so salty? Or you describe someone's character as being salty. And that usually means when someone is acting unreasonably bitter or irritated. But that's not really the Bible's meaning here. From Eliot's commentary, which I found on BibleHub.com, it says, "Salt preserves from putrefaction and corruption." I'm pretty sure none of us want to eat putrefied food. Also, from its antiseptic and savory qualities, salt became the symbol of hospitality, friendship, durability, fidelity. To eat bread and salt together is, in the East, an expression for a league of mutual amity. I didn't realize that salt was so representative of hospitality. And that's one of the reasons why it's mentioned so much throughout the Bible. Eliot also notes that salt is representative of an everlasting covenant. And we see this, for example, in 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 5. It says, "Don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt?" How did I miss that? Have you ever read those verses before and seen that? The term "a covenant of salt" is throughout Scripture in the Old Testament. And I never stopped to realize that, or maybe stopped to question it. I know I must have read it and seen it before, but I just never processed that because it seems like an odd thing to me. Salt is not something that is very valuable in our society. It's not something that is super expensive or hard to come by, but it was in the Old Testament. It was in Old Testament times. And so we'll get back to that in just a minute. I don't want to get too far ahead. But salt also always had to accompany a sacrifice in the Old Testament. It says, "Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings." And that's in Leviticus 2. But not only was salt added to meat, but it was also added to grain offerings and bread. So more about salt. Salt enhances flavors and even strengthens the structure of the dough. Salt is, or was, valuable back then. And it's reflected in the phrase, which you might have heard, someone is worth his or her salt. Nowadays, again, we don't see salt as something valuable or expensive, so that phrase doesn't quite make sense to us, but we still use it, I think, today. At least I've heard it used, worth his or her salt. Another thing about salt is salt kills or slows the growth of yeast or fungus. Yeast is a fungus, and it's used to make dough rise. And this made me think about Matthew 16, verses 5 to 12, where Jesus warns the disciples to avoid the yeast of the Pharisees, or the teaching of the Pharisees. As we're told in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 1, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. I think something Jesus wanted us to avoid was being puffed up on knowledge like the Pharisees were. But salt is something that's going to slow that growth or even kill that growth of puffed up knowledge or yeast or fungus. Hopefully that all comes together for you like it did for me. But if not, that's okay. We'll keep moving forward. So another thing about salt is that salt preserves, which was valuable in a society that didn't have refrigerators or freezers like we do today. It was extremely helpful for the priests who would partake in some of the sacrificed food. So all of those things are what makes salt such a valuable thing. And we don't even really stop to think about it today. But hopefully that kind of enhances this one little scripture for you to help you think about being the salt of the earth. It's actually quite an important and valuable thing. And you don't need to overdo it. Like even a little salt will bring out flavor. You think about, you add like a pinch of salt to cookie dough, and that brings out the flavors. It makes the flavors come together in such a way that there is just enough sweetness without being too much. And you don't actually taste the salt, which thankfully, I mean, unless you put in too much salt, which I'm sure has happened in some cookie dough batches here and there. But when done right, you don't even really taste the salt outright. You taste all of the flavors coming together. Anyway, all that said, how do you feel about being salty? What might it look like to bring out the richness of God's character and his creation, or to glorify God, or to point people towards God as being the salt of the earth? Colossians 4, verses 5 to 6 gives us some advice on this. It says, "Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." Let's chat again one more time tomorrow for this week, and we'll finish out this series on the Beatitudes and the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount.
Thank you for listening to The Bible for Busy People. If you need prayer or want to go deeper in your faith, visit our show notes. Will you take a moment to share with a friend and leave a review? It helps the Bible get into even more people's minds and hearts. Find more podcasts that will recharge you at purposely.com.